Emily stepped onto the plane with her usual grace, the smooth hum of the engines a comforting backdrop to the soft chatter of passengers, already settling into their seats. She walked the aisles, her smile wide, as she greeted each face familiar and new. But something felt off today. The air felt heavier, the usual buzz of excitement before takeoff seemed muted. Her gaze kept flickering toward a man sitting alone by the window. He was older than most passengers today, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s. He had a calm air about him. But it was unnerving. It wasn't the kind of calm that reassured you. It was the kind of calm that made you feel like something was being observed, she told herself. It was nothing. Maybe he was just a quiet man, or maybe he had a long flight ahead of him. But no matter how many times she glanced at him, there was that sense that he wasn't just another passenger. He was someone who didn't belong here. She forced a smile as she reached his row. She was trained for moments like this, trained to remain calm, no matter what. But as she offered him the usual friendly greeting, she noticed his eyes locked on her, steady and deliberate. He didn't look away, and that unnerved her. A small flicker of unease crept up her spine, but she dismissed it with a polite nod and moved on with her service. The rest of the flight passed like it always did. The rhythmic sound of the engines, the soft murmurs of the passengers, the occasional announcement over the intercom, everything felt routine. But that man, that unsettling presence, never left her mind as she walked the aisles, checking in with passengers, making sure they were comfortable. She couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were always on her when she turned to face him. He was there watching, but not in a casual way, not like someone lost and thought. No, his gaze was sharp, focused, almost like he was studying her, observing her movements, analyzing her every step. She stopped at the back of the plane for a moment, pretending to check on the other passengers. But she knew she was stalling just to gather her thoughts. What was it about him that made her feel this way? She wasn't used to feeling unsettled, not in her line of work. She had dealt with difficult situations before: angry passengers, spilled drinks, nervous travelers. She'd even managed emergency landings without breaking a sweat. But this was different. This wasn't an emergency. This was something else entirely. She glanced toward the front of the cabin and saw him again, sitting perfectly still, staring out the window now, his face expressionless, his posture rigid. He looked like he was waiting for something. But what Emily couldn't say, she told herself. She was just being paranoid. Maybe she was overthinking it. After all, there were other things to focus on, like ensuring the rest of the flight went smoothly. So she took a deep breath and moved on. But even as she passed his row again, she felt it, the weight of his gaze, following her every move, as if he was waiting for her to make the wrong move, to slip up. And that thought sent a jolt through her chest. It was small, but it was there. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt the unfamiliar stirrings of doubt. She wasn't in control anymore. She had no idea what was going on. But something about that man was making her nervous, making her question everything she'd thought she knew about her job and about the people she served. And that thought lingered with her like an unwanted shadow. As the plane ascended into the sky, Emily returned to her duties, but that feeling remained in the pit of her stomach. No matter how many times she glanced at the other passengers, no matter how many times she tried to focus on the tasks at hand, her mind kept drifting back to the man sitting by the window. He hadn't moved since the takeoff. His eyes were still fixed on her every step. And every time she passed his row, it felt like he was silently waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to do something wrong. She tried to shake it off and focused on the routine meal service. But even as she handed out trays of food and drinks, she couldn't help but notice that his gaze followed her every time she came near his row. It wasn't just the typical glance of a traveler who was mildly interested in what was going on around them. No, this was different. This was deliberate. This was calculated. And the thought made her feel like a prey animal under the watchful eyes of a predator. Emily tried to ignore it, but with each trip down the aisle, his eyes never wavered. And when she finally found herself standing in front of his row again, she couldn't help but feel a cold chill run through her body. It was as if the air around them had shifted, and for a moment she found herself almost trapped in the silence of his stare. She offered him the usual smile, but this time it didn't feel like enough. This time his eyes didn't just meet hers, they pierced into her, like he was searching for something inside her, something that didn't belong, or maybe something she didn't even know was there. She forced herself to break the gaze and move on. But as she did, she noticed something strange in the corner of her eye. He hadn't just been looking at her this time. His attention had shifted to the passengers around him for just a split second. She saw his eyes scanning the faces of the people seated nearby, and in that brief moment, something clicked in her mind. This wasn't about her, this wasn't personal. It was methodical, it was deliberate. He was studying everything and everyone on this flight, and it made her uneasy. The longer she thought about it, the more she realized how strange everything had become. The air was thick with tension. Now it was no longer just her own feelings of unease. It was in the subtle shift, in the passengers' behavior too. She noticed people fidgeting in their seats, casting nervous glances toward the front of the cabin, like they were all aware of something she wasn't aware of. A ripple of whispers moved through the aisles like a slow wave just beneath the surface, and it dawned on her that the man wasn't the only one causing discomfort. Everyone on the flight had become a little more alert, a little more uneasy. But it was the way they looked at him that was even stranger. It wasn't just suspicion or curiosity. It was something darker, something more primal, fear maybe. But not just fear, fear mixed with confusion, like no one quite understood why they were afraid, but they all knew they were. And it was contagious. Emily felt it too. She knew something wasn't right, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her once more, and she resisted the urge to glance back. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that he was waiting for her to make the next move. What did he want from her? What was he waiting for? And why did it feel like he wasn't just a passenger on this flight, but someone who had an agenda, someone who had a purpose far beyond just getting to his destination? She moved toward the galley, but even there the sense of being watched didn't fade. It followed her like a shadow. It was as if he knew exactly where she was at all times, and the thought alone made her hands shake slightly as she prepared drinks and snacks for the passengers. She couldn't escape it. No matter how much she tried, she couldn't escape the sensation that the man in the window seat wasn't just watching her, he was waiting for something to happen. And that something was slowly creeping closer with each passing minute. Emily could feel the air shift around her. As she moved back into the cabin, she couldn't shake the unease crawling under her skin. The man had become a constant presence in her mind, and every time she passed his row, it was like walking through a thick fog that made it hard to breathe. She tried to focus on her duties, on checking in with the other passengers, making small talk, but it wasn't enough. Her thoughts kept drifting back to him, to those cold eyes that never blinked, and the unsettling feeling that his gaze never wavered, even when she wasn't looking directly at him. It was like he knew exactly where she was at all times, and his presence lingered, even when she wasn't near him. Something wasn't right. She could feel it growing stronger with each passing moment. There was a shift in the cabin. Now the passengers were quieter than usual. There was an odd tension in the air that made the usual hum of the plane feel suffocating. It was almost as if they could feel it too, the weight of something unseen pressing down on them, like they were all aware of a presence in the room that none of them fully understood, but all of them instinctively feared. As Emily walked down the aisle again, she could see them watching her, the eyes of the passengers flickering nervously toward the front of the plane every now. And then some seemed to glance at the man too, but no one dared to speak of it, not out loud anyway. They didn't want to acknowledge the feeling that hung thick, like smoke in the air, something that couldn't be explained, but that everyone could sense. Emily moved with purpose through the aisles, trying to push away the growing panic that threatened to rise within her. But the sensation of being watched was becoming unbearable. It was suffocating. And when she finally found herself standing near the man's row, once more she caught his eyes again. This time they were different. There was something in them, something that made her stomach turn. The cold calculation was still there, but now there was something else, a glint of amusement, almost like he was enjoying this, like he was watching her struggle, trying to figure out what was going on, and it made her skin crawl. There was something so deliberate about the way he watched her, like he was testing her, making her feel like a piece in some larger game that she didn't understand. She tried to push the thought away, but it kept coming back no matter how many times. She tried to focus on other things. It felt like he was one step ahead, like he knew what she was thinking before she even did. As the flight continued, the sense of unease in the cabin grew stronger. Emily couldn't deny it anymore. The man wasn't just a strange passenger. He was a threat. She didn't know what kind of threat, but it was clear that he wasn't who he appeared to be. There was something about him that didn't fit in. He wasn't just another traveler passing through. He had a purpose. He had an agenda. And somehow Emily had become a part of it. She couldn't stop herself from glancing back at him one more time as she passed by his row. And this time he was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't the kind of smile that reassured you or made you feel at ease. It was a thin smile that sent chills down her spine, like he knew something she didn't, something that she wasn't supposed to know. She felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up and quickly moved away from him. But the unease didn't leave her. It only grew stronger. It was like a shadow following her. No matter where she went, no matter how much she tried to ignore it, she couldn't escape it. And that was the most unsettling part of all. This wasn't just about the man. This wasn't just a feeling of being watched. It was something deeper, something that made her question whether she could trust her own instincts, whether she was truly in control, or if she was simply a player in someone else's game, a game she hadn't agreed to play, but couldn't seem to escape. As Emily made her way toward the galley, her heart raced. The weight of the man's gaze still pressed against her back. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. It was like something was closing in on her, but she couldn't escape it. She tried to push the thoughts out of her head. She tried to focus on the usual routine, on getting the passengers what they needed, but it was impossible. With every movement she made, she could feel his eyes following her. Every inch of her body seemed to react to his silent observation, like a predator closing in on its prey. She could feel the tension rising, not just in herself, but in the entire cabin. It wasn't just the quiet hum of the plane anymore. It was the low buzz of something unspoken, something almost electric. It was the way the passengers were behaving too. They were more on edge now, quieter than usual, as if they too sensed something wrong, but couldn't pinpoint what it was. As she worked in the galley, she kept glancing out into the cabin, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared drinks. But each time she looked out there, he was sitting perfectly still, not looking out the window anymore now. His eyes were fixed on her, and his expression had changed. There was something almost knowing about it, something sinister, like he had some kind of power over her, like he was the one in control and not her. And the thought made her blood run cold. She tried to keep busy, tried to focus on her work. But when the plane hit a patch of turbulence and the lights flickered for a moment, she felt her heart stop. The cabin plunged into darkness for only a few seconds, but in those seconds everything felt wrong. The air felt thick and heavy, like something terrible was about to happen. And when the lights returned, she saw him standing. He was no longer sitting in his seat. The man was standing in the aisle, slowly taking deliberate steps toward the back of the cabin. His movements were fluid, almost predatory, and as his gaze met hers from across the aisle, it felt like time had frozen. She couldn't look away. It was like he was pulling her in with his eyes, drawing her toward him. And she felt a cold shiver race down her spine as she tried to make herself move. But her body was frozen. She was trapped in the gaze of a man she didn't understand, a man who had become the center of every unsettling thought she'd had during this flight. He continued walking toward her, taking each step slowly, like he knew she couldn't move fast enough to escape him. And the closer he got, the harder it became to breathe. The air felt thinner, almost suffocating, and she could hear the faint sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. He was only a few feet away now. And she tried to smile, but it felt forced, it felt fake, like a mask she wore to hide the terror that was beginning to crawl under her skin. The man's face was expressionless. But his eyes never left hers. They burned with an intensity that made her skin crawl. And for a brief moment she wondered if he knew something she didn't, if he was going to say something that would change everything. And just as he reached her, he stopped, his face inches from hers. He was so close she could smell his cologne, the faint trace of something sharp and metallic. And before she could react, before she could even think to speak, he simply whispered in a voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it, "You know they're watching, don't you?" And in that instant Emily's stomach dropped. She had no idea what he meant. But the chill that ran through her veins told her it wasn't a question, it was a statement. And in that moment, everything around her seemed to fall away. The sounds of the plane faded, the passengers' voices turned to a dull hum, and all she could focus on was his words, and the undeniable feeling that she was no longer in control, that somehow the flight had become a game she wasn't prepared to play. Emily's mind raced as she stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The words he whispered still echoed in her ears like a haunting refrain. She tried to pull herself together, but it was hard when every instinct inside her screamed to run, to escape the suffocating weight of the man's gaze. But she couldn't move, she couldn't break the connection that felt like a tether tying her to him, something cold, something dark. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers. Now they weren't just glancing at him anymore. They were watching him, watching her, and the uncomfortable whispers grew louder, like a swarm of insects, buzzing just out of reach. And suddenly the air felt too thin, like there was nowhere left to hide, like she was trapped in the middle of this strange, unsettling game. And the stakes were higher than she could have imagined. The man didn't move, his eyes never left hers. As he spoke again, his voice lower now, almost a whisper that she had to strain to hear. "You think you're safe, but you're not, you never were." His words hung in the air like a threat she didn't understand. And she wanted to scream, but her voice felt trapped in her chest, her throat dry, her mind scrambling for an explanation. But there was none, nothing made sense, nothing added up. Why was he doing this? Why was he so fixated on her? Her mind raced through every possible scenario, every reason he could be acting this way. But none of them felt right, none of them fit. The puzzle pieces were scattered and incomplete. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She could only stand there feeling small and powerless in front of him. He smiled, then a slow, sinister grin that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. He didn't move, though he remained where he stood in the aisle, blocking her path. His presence felt oppressive, and with each passing second, his smile seemed to grow wider, as if he were enjoying this moment, enjoying watching her unravel, watching her try to understand a game that she didn't know the rules to. And just when she thought she might break, just when the silence between them felt unbearable, he stepped back and walked away as if nothing had happened. He didn't glance back, he didn't say another word, he simply turned and moved down the aisle with deliberate steps, leaving Emily standing there like she had just awoken from a nightmare. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. She could feel the unease still crawling under her skin as she moved back to the galley, her mind spinning. She couldn't focus on her duties anymore. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong, something was terribly wrong. And now there was this horrible realization gnawing at her that maybe she had been too late to notice whatever it was that was happening. She turned around quickly, almost expecting him to be standing there waiting for her. But the aisle was empty. The passengers were still seated quietly, as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. She couldn't explain it, she couldn't put it into words, but there was a shift in the air, a shift in the tension that had settled over the cabin. It wasn't just her feeling it now, it was everyone. She could see it in their eyes. They were all aware of something, even if they didn't know what it was. But she knew she had to get a grip, she had to stay focused. This wasn't about her, this wasn't about whatever game the man was playing. This was a flight, and it needed to be completed. She needed to finish her shift. She needed to get the passengers off safely. But the thought of that man, the thought of his gaze, and those words haunted her like a shadow lurking just out of sight. She couldn't let it consume her, not yet, not when she still had a job to do. But with every passing minute she felt more and more like she was losing control, like something was slipping through her fingers. And when she finally caught her breath enough to look out into the cabin again, she saw him sitting there at the back of the plane, looking right at her, his eyes cold and unblinking. And this time she wasn't sure if he was watching her, or if he was waiting for her to make the first move. The feeling in the cabin was heavier now, like a storm was brewing in the air. Every time Emily moved, she felt it, the eyes of the passengers on her, the quiet tension that was impossible to ignore. She could hear whispers now, low murmurs, that seemed to fill the space between her and the rest of the flight. She couldn't understand all of it, but the tone was unmistakable. It was fear, and it was spreading like wildfire. The man wasn't just a strange passenger anymore. He had become the center of everything. The way he looked at her, the way he moved, the way the entire atmosphere shifted. When he entered a room, Emily's heart beat faster with every passing second. She tried to ignore it, tried to keep going through the motions, but it was getting harder to pretend nothing was wrong. She couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, that the game he was playing wasn't just a game, it was real. And she was caught in the middle of it all. Her hands trembled as she moved through the cabin, checking on passengers, making sure they were comfortable. But it was harder than usual. It was hard to focus when the weight of the man's stare was pressing down on her so hard that it felt like she was suffocating. She tried to breathe deeply to calm herself, but it didn't work, not when every inch of her body screamed that something was wrong. She glanced toward the back of the plane, and there he was sitting quietly watching her, and this time there was no mistaking it. His eyes weren't just following her, they were tracking her movements methodically, like he was planning something. And it made her stomach churn. There was no way to explain it. But she knew she was being watched. She knew it wasn't just about observation anymore. It was about control. He wasn't just watching her. He was waiting for something. And the thought made her skin crawl. She felt the cold sweat on her palms as she moved to the galley again, her mind racing. What did he want from her? What was his end game? She had no answers, only more questions. And the fear that something had already been set in motion that she couldn't stop. But she couldn't give in to that fear. She couldn't let it control her. Not now, not when everything depended on her staying calm. She had a job to do. She had to finish the flight, keep everyone safe, and get them to their destination. But every time she thought she had herself under control, she felt that pressure building again, like a storm waiting to break. The more she tried to push it away, the more it intensified, like a growing wave that threatened to swallow her whole. She turned quickly, looking down the aisle, and there he was again, standing now, blocking her path. She couldn't move forward, not unless she walked right past him. And she knew she couldn't do that, not now, not after everything that had happened. She could feel her pulse quicken, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. As the distance between them closed, she felt like a rabbit cornered by a predator, unable to escape. No matter how fast she moved, no matter how much she tried to get away from him, he was there standing in her way, and she had no idea what he was going to do next. All she knew was that she had to act quickly before he made the first move. But what could she do? She was a flight attendant, not a security officer. She wasn't trained to deal with this kind of situation. She had no idea what she was up against. And that thought terrified her more than anything else. Could she even trust her instincts anymore? Could she really believe that what was happening was as dangerous as it seemed? Could she make it out of this alive, when every part of her was screaming that something was about to go horribly wrong? And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he moved aside, silently allowing her to pass. And for a split second, Emily thought she might have imagined the whole thing. But as she walked past him, she felt it again, that cold shiver that shot down her spine. And when she dared to look back, he was watching her with that same unnerving smile, and the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It wasn't just a routine trip from one place to another. She was in the middle of something far more dangerous than she could have ever prepared for, and the thought made her knees weaken. She had no control, not anymore. Emily's mind was spinning, her thoughts racing like a blur. She couldn't focus, her heart was hammering against her chest, and every step she took felt like it was leading her deeper into a nightmare. She couldn't wake up from the man's eyes, never left her. Not once. He was like a shadow stalking her from the corner of her vision, and no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, she couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was horribly wrong with the situation. She couldn't explain it, she couldn't put it into words, but it felt like the whole plane was suffocating under the weight of an unseen threat, something that had been there all along, but that only now seemed to make sense. And the more she tried to reason with herself, the more the fear gnawed at her like a cold hand, gripping her insides. The whispers in the cabin grew louder now. She could hear them clearly. The passengers were talking in low voices, looking toward the back of the plane at the man. And there was something in their eyes, something that made her stomach twist. They weren't just scared, they were afraid for their lives. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel it too. She could see it in the way their bodies were tense, the way they were shifting nervously in their seats, some of them glancing out the window, as if hoping to see something that would reassure them that this wasn't real. But there was nothing out there, nothing to offer them comfort. Emily was starting to feel the pressure close in on her. The walls of the plane felt like they were closing in tighter and tighter with each passing moment. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't think clearly. Her body was reacting to the growing panic in ways she couldn't control, and it made everything worse. She could feel the sweat on her palms, her heart racing faster with every step she took, as if she was being pulled down a hallway that had no end. She didn't know what to do, where to go, how to escape the feeling of being trapped. It was like there was no way out, no way to make sense of the chaos that had taken over the flight. She moved through the aisles now, trying to keep her cool, trying to keep her composure. But she couldn't stop the feeling of dread crawling over her, like a wave ready to drown her. She reached the back of the plane, and then stopped. The silence back here was different. It was thick and suffocating, like the air was too heavy to breathe. She turned quickly, and there he was standing at the back of the plane again, his gaze locked on her, his smile wider now. But it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was a smile of knowing, like he had all the answers. And she was the one still trying to figure it out. The man hadn't moved from his spot. He stood there motionless, but his presence was more intense than ever. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was the center of everything. He was the reason for the tension that filled the cabin. He was the cause of the fear that was spreading like wildfire through every corner of the plane. And Emily's heart skipped a beat as he took a step toward her. She froze for a moment, unable to look away from him. Her mind screamed at her to move, but her body betrayed her. She couldn't tear herself from his gaze, couldn't escape the feeling that he was drawing her in with each step he took toward her. It felt like a slow dance of death, like he was closing in, and there was no way to stop it, no way to outrun it. The closer he got, the harder it became to breathe the air around them, thickening the fear in her chest, becoming a palpable weight, as if it was crushing her from the inside out. And then finally he stopped, just inches away, his presence overwhelming, his eyes never leaving hers. And he whispered again, his voice low and steady, like he was telling her a secret. "You're in my world now, not the other way around." His words hung in the air, like a heavy fog, clouding her thoughts, like a spell she couldn't break. And she knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same again, not after what he said, not after the way he looked at her, with such cold certainty, as if everything she thought she knew was a lie, as if he was the one pulling the strings, and she was just a pawn in his game, a pawn who had no idea how deep this trap went, or what would happen when it was finally sprung. And she wanted to scream, but the words were caught in her throat as she realized the terrifying truth that she was no longer in control. She never had been. Emily's heart pounded like a drum, her body frozen in place. As the man's words hung in the air like a suffocating fog, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was trapped. The walls of the plane felt like they were closing in tighter with every passing second. The whispers from the passengers grew louder now. There was no denying it. They were all aware of the tension. They could feel the storm building. They could feel the shift in the air. But no one dared to speak up. No one dared to confront what was happening. It was like they were all caught in a nightmare that none of them could wake from. The man's smile never faltered. He was enjoying this, enjoying watching her squirm under his gaze, enjoying the power he held over her. And she could see it now, the way he moved, like he was in complete control, like everything in this cabin had been orchestrated for him. She couldn't escape. It couldn't escape him. And the reality of that realization hit her like a brick wall. This wasn't just about a passenger who had crossed a line. This wasn't just about a strange encounter. This was something far darker, something far more dangerous. And she had been caught in the middle of it all from the very beginning. Her mind raced for a solution, for a way to regain control. But there was nothing, there were no answers, just more questions, more confusion, and the sense that she was sinking deeper into a trap that was closing around her like a vice, tightening with every moment. The man took another step closer, his presence overwhelming, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't get them out. The fear was too strong. Her body refused to obey. And as he moved closer, she felt herself backing away, her legs shaky beneath her, as if her body knew what her mind refused to accept. She could feel the weight of his stare burning into her, every inch of her skin prickling, like he was touching her without ever laying a finger on her. And just when she thought she might break, just when she thought she couldn't take another second of his presence, he spoke again, his voice a soft whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "You've been watched the entire time they've been watching you, and now it's time for you to realize the truth." His words were a blade slicing through her composure, and in that moment, Emily felt her world unravel. Her heart felt like it was about to explode, her mind racing as the weight of his words sank in. They had been watching her. Who was watching her? What truth was he talking about? She felt like she was losing her grip on reality, like she was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't understand. And before she could react, before she could scream or fight back, she heard the sound, the unmistakable sound of the emergency exit door being opened. The sound sliced through the silence of the cabin like a knife, and her breath caught in her throat. She turned quickly, her eyes wide with terror. And there it was, the emergency door was open wide, and she could see the dark abyss of the night sky stretching out beyond the cabin, a drop that seemed to stretch forever into nothingness, the wind rushing in from outside. And the realization hit her with full force. The man wasn't just playing a game. He wasn't just toying with her. He had planned this. From the start, he had orchestrated everything. Every moment, every move she had made had been a part of his plan. And now he was getting what he wanted, the chaos, the fear, the power, the control. She was just a piece in his game, a piece that he had been slowly manipulating until it was time for her to understand the truth. And in that moment, it wasn't just her life on the line. It was the lives of everyone aboard the plane. They were all caught in this web. And Emily was the only one who knew what was coming, what had already begun. And she felt the overwhelming pressure to stop it, to do something, anything. But she didn't know how the man's voice echoed in her ears as he stepped closer. "You never had control, not really." And as he moved past her, his presence leaving a cold trail in the air, she understood what he meant. He was the one in control, the one who had been pulling the strings all along. And as the plane continued its flight toward the unknown, Emily was left standing there helpless and caught in the middle of something far darker than she could have ever imagined, trapped in a game she couldn't win.